With the internet blowing up with the photos of Space Shuttle Endeavour being stacked for the first time since retirement at the California Science Center, we wanted to talk to someone who gets to look after a space shuttle.
And while we were in Washington, D.C. last month, we got to speak to Dr. Jennifer Levasseur, who amongst other things is the Smithsonian Curator for the Space Shuttle.
Have you ever visited a space shuttle? Let us know about your experience via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website.
And come and join us at patreon.com/Space and Things. But right now, it's time for episode 181 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but it is right this time. You're listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 181 of our podcast. How you doing, Emily?
I'm doing good. A little bit rumpled looking right now, but I'm looking at myself on the Zoom thing. Thankfully, none of y'all can see me.
I can.
Dave is like, oh my God. Other than that, nothing exciting going on. How you doing, Dave?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Not too bad. So, shall we crack on with this week's topic?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Okay, as we said in the intro, the internet, or the kind of places on the internet where Emily and I hang out, has seen a number of incredible images and videos come out from the California Science Center, where they have successfully lifted up the Space Shuttle Endeavour and stacked it with an external tank and 2 solid rocket motors. The shuttle is currently shrink-wrapped for protection, and they're about to start building a brand new building around this fully stacked shuttle. But it's great to see a shuttle standing up again and looking like it's ready for launch. So with that in mind, we wanted to talk about the space shuttle and speak to someone who looks after one.
Well, our trip to Washington, D.C. provided us with the perfect opportunity as we sat down with Dr. Jennifer Levasseur, who is currently the curator of the space shuttle for the Smithsonian. Some of you may have heard Jennifer before if you've listened to the Apollo 13-minute podcast about the Apollo 13-minute movie. But if not, here's her biography as written on the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum website. Dr. Jennifer Levasseur received her BA in History from the University of Michigan in 1999, an MA in American Studies from George Washington University in 2002, and a PhD in History from George Mason University in 2014. Her book, Through Astronaut Eyes, Photography from Early Human Spaceflight, which was published through Purdue University Press in July 2020, looks at the cultural significance of astronaut photography. She serves as the responsible curator for the museum's astronaut cameras, chronographs, the Space Shuttle, and International Space Station programs.
Prior to her work at the National Air and Space Museum, she worked as a historic interpreter at George Washington's Mount Vernon. She started her Smithsonian career with an internship at the National Portrait Gallery's Department of Photography. There, she catalogued photographs acquired through donation and developed strategies for recording portrait information in the museum's electronic database.
In over 20 years at the museum, Jennifer has worked on a variety of projects, including artifact loans, the biennial Mutual Concerns of Air and Space Museums Conference, and as a department representative on digital projects. She curated the 2015 Spacewalk Anniversary exhibit outside the spacecraft, 50 Years of Extravehicular Activity, co-curated One World Connected, and is working on a new human spaceflight exhibit.
So let's talk to Dr. Levasseur.
Houston, Space and Things base here. Dave and Emily have landed on a great episode, so stay tuned for more Space and Things.
Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Before we get stuck into talking about the shuttle, we like to find out a little bit about our guests. So was spaceflight always a big part of your life, or is it something that you've just ended up working in?
I think it's a little bit of both. So at the time, I don't think I really saw it as being this thing that was part of my life, but it was, and it kind of accumulated and magically turned into a career back in 2002. So I grew up in southeastern Michigan, which was on the border with Toledo. In fact, I was born in Toledo, Ohio. And our nightly television featured the senator from Ohio in the 1980s, John Glenn. And
course.
so I was very, very aware of who the astronauts were. I would sometimes visit different places, museums in particular, in Southeast Michigan or otherwise, where I would, certainly have learned about astronauts. I have often and even blogged about it at some point in the past about sitting on the floor in fourth grade watching Challenger. So a number of these kinds of incidents happened over the course of my life that I didn't really think meant anything, but they certainly did. So once I got to college, I went to the University of Michigan, and when John Glenn was going to fly, I was not going to miss that day. I had an Italian Renaissance class, and I made an excuse that I had a dentist appointment and didn't go to class because I wanted to go down and watch the launch. But I innocently thought no one would ever show up to something like that in the middle of a day of classes. And I was amongst 200 other students watching it in the Michigan Union. I was, in fact, late to the game. So by the time I got there to watch that, it was just, I kind of looked around and realized we all had been children in fourth grade or something when we sat and watched Challenger. So clearly we have this thing. And no one moved a muscle until the moment we knew that 73 seconds had passed, basically.
Yeah.
We kind of have that burned into our psyche, that you can't move a muscle until you know that they've gone for throttle up, and then everything can, we can all go back to class and do our thing. So it was just this very surreal experience. And moving here to DC to go to graduate school, it did not enter my mind that I would end up working. I knew I had gotten a degree in American history, so I assumed I would get a job at an American history museum.
Yeah.
And I didn't really think, it's going to be a technology, air and space museum. But of course, as soon as I sat down in the interview, it just sort of struck me all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this is where I belong.
Wow.
So, yeah, it was very strange.
So the shuttle program is enormous. It was launching for 30 years, but really its development was over 40 years. So the program can be broken up into several different phases. How do you do this as a curator for those who may not be familiar with its history?
It can be really challenging, but one of the things that we draw on as curators in the museum is the collection. And one of the most wonderful things that I've come to discover in the last almost 4 years of being the curator for the Space Shuttle Program is the richness of our artifact collection to tell the earliest part of the story, which is the development of the idea, the actual, how is this going to work and fulfill the promises. And so it's that pre-launch development phase, the A, B, C, all these different phases that it goes through in development. And we have a really wonderful model collection. And so when we have an exhibition that deals with trying to, in some ways, relate that story, whether it be near Space Shuttle Discovery or here in the National Mall building, those models play a huge role in that, because you can talk about solid propellants versus liquid propellants. You can talk about reusability, partial reusability versus full reusability. What does that really look like? And so that's how we've done it over the last, say, 15 years or so, is really to set those pairings or those groupings together to be able to show you as a visitor, this is what this looks like versus what this looks like. And the same thing is true for the next phases. So we can show you what astronauts were wearing in the early shuttle program, which looks dramatically different from what they wear post-Challenger. And certainly for the final phases, it's a little bit different. It's much more complex. We're talking much more about ISS at that point.
So this is maybe a controversial question, but how do you reconcile the shuttle's known issues? Because obviously it was a flawed program, with its hopes and promises and its triumphs as well.
So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, especially now that I've started to publish. I had been publishing on other things, other topics, more Apollo era stuff for so long. And I finally got my opportunity to really think through this in the last 6 to 9 months, is how do I personally reconcile with it? Because it was such a part of my childhood, and I'm watching launches and, learning who the astronauts were. And now as a professional in this world, meeting these people who were involved in this program. And that's really where my reconciliation comes, is with the people who are involved in it. And it's certainly not just astronauts. So having met people when Discovery was brought here in 2012, meeting the workers who installed things in the payload bay or would, do all these various things. And we still work with some of those people who were involved back when the shuttle was operating. And so the story that I focus on for the most part are the individuals who contributed to the successes that do exist. I don't think it's that hard to really recognize that the space shuttle was responsible for, we would not have an International Space Station if there was not a space shuttle. That largely has to come from something that can carry these. It could happen other ways. There's no denying that there are lots of different ways to do things to get to space. But, the Hubble Space Telescope and so many other things that are launched through the 80s and 90s, the scientific work that's done, just the amount of learning and understanding about low Earth orbit, and then thinking about what can be done elsewhere. I think I'm not really comparing or weighing any of the negativity with the, positive outcomes. It's just that I do my best in my curatorial work and any writing I do to think and kind of reason it out that there inevitably with creating technologies come problems, and how those problems are overcome is more important to me sometimes than dwelling on the things that went wrong. I certainly need to explain those things. We need to kind of talk through that, but how those have been overcome is kind of the way I approach that.
I don't think you can talk about the shuttle without talking about IMAX, because I think, Emily, I think I can speak on your behalf as well. When you think about how we experience shuttle as younger people, one of our first experiences without seeing a launch perhaps was seeing The Dream is Alive, for example, which is an incredible documentary or a film. I don't know what the correct way of calling it would be, but it's an incredible resource now to look back at what it was like on the shuttle pre-Challenger. And of course, you've got an extra collection with that because you've got Discovery, and it was the first launch of Discovery. So, and I know you've got a history with cameras as well. So can we talk a bit about how important the IMAX camera was? And have you got that as well?
Yeah. So in 2012, IMAX, or actually 2011 or so, IMAX, the company, contacted us and said, we still have the hardware that was used to film. It's all they're the 2D cameras. So they switched over to 3D in sort of the early to mid 90s. There were some crossover movies that kind of used a little bit of both. But by the time you have something like the Space Station 3D movie, obviously they're using different equipment. But yeah, they contacted us and were interested in donating it. So, and the other thing, it's not just one camera. There's the camera that the crew used inside the crew compartment, but there's also a camera that then goes out and is in the payload bay and is used on multiple different. And that's actually sometimes one of the more fun views, because you can imagine being in the shoes of an astronaut on an EVA in a much different way, or if you were clinging to some piece of equipment that was being sent off into space. And so there's some incredible footage of all of that. But the way we phrase it in our exhibitry is it's bringing spaceflight down to Earth. IMAX is such a huge and immersive format that has existed certainly since I was a kid, that sitting in a room where the screen kind of like pulls you in almost makes you feel like you're there. And it's one of the only ways I can think of where person who is not an astronaut, other than virtual reality, which is much more of a thing now, but you get really you feel a part of something that is not what you're used to. You get a sense of floating that you may not get just, we talk about what it's like to be in a swimming pool or something like that. Those things, are similar, but IMAX just has an incredible quality to really kind of suck you in. And it's obviously the quality of the picture is amazing. And there was a really strong dedication on the part of not only the IMAX team, but folks here at the museum who were involved in developing those concepts, and the people at Lockheed Martin for actually doing all of the logistics side of things to make it happen. And the astronauts, they were trained by real movie cinematographers.
Amazing.
They were trained to be the surrogates of those folks and those directors and really be sort of part of it. They're the film crew, and they're not necessarily trained as filmmakers. There's probably none that are trained as filmmakers. So that's one of the things I've always been fascinated by, is how many roles an astronaut has to play and how many different things they have to learn. And IMAX just kind of really added this whole other layer of consideration where you've got to think about setting and landscape and the content of those images being so huge. And it was really successful. And that's what's really, I think, pretty amazing about it is that the director, Tony Myers, who directed all of the space movies, told me when she visited in 2012, they used every single frame that they ever captured. So everything you can pull from any of the Space IMAX movies, that's everything. And so it really kind of overwhelms you that these 70 millimeter reels of film were carried into space. There's a tactile quality to these films that doesn't exist necessarily today because it's all done digitally. But when you see the IMAX camera, it is this beast. I appreciate the IMAX camera mostly because I come from the Midwest where my father is a metal worker. He works in the tool and die industry. And so getting to see the actual exterior of the camera and the machining that's done, it is so handmade. This does not come off of an assembly line or anything like that.
Yeah.
You can really appreciate its unique nature as an artifact, but as a technology. And so it's just every time I get to see it, it kind of takes my breath away a little bit because it makes me personally connect with a lot of things. Those are the types of stories or things I would love to be able to tell people more. I do it in formats like this. It's really hard to do it in an exhibit where you get 30 words to say, this is how important this thing is. But I would love to be able to say, look at this millwork here. Look at, you can really tell so much more by just really examining an artifact. And that's true of Discovery very clearly. If you get to go stand by it, its character is kind of all on the outside. It's not that there's not character on the inside, but the very first time I saw Discovery not on a launch pad when it rolled into our building was I said, it kind of looks like a used car.
Yeah.
It's got some mileage on it. I think about it sort of the Indiana Jones. It's not the years, it's the mileage.
Yeah.
It really shows. That mileage shows and it gives it this wonderful character.
Absolutely. How challenging is it to connect with a personal story with the shuttle? Because, and in some ways this may make it easier, but in some ways it makes it a lot harder. There was 135 missions. I don't even know how many astronauts flew on the shuttle, the exact number.
Over 5, it's hundreds.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. Like, how do you make that connect? Because I think it's sometimes easier with the Apollo program. There was 11 flying missions, only 3 astronauts on each one. They had a set goal. Each shuttle mission was so completely different. And telling that story in such a short space of time in a museum must be incredibly challenging.
It's next to impossible. And we can't, I don't think, do justice to it. We've tried a few different methods. In my last exhibit, we did a slideshow of all the crew portraits. So we tried to pick not only the very, normal straight-laced ones, but some of the really fun ones.
Yeah.
We tried to highlight certain individuals who were notable people, Franklin Chang Diaz or Ellen Ochoa, or someone who kind of is culturally referred to and, for particular reasons, Sally Ride, obviously, people like her. I think that's kind of our driving principle in a sense, is that we want to utilize stories that help us connect with anyone who can come in the door.
Yeah.
So I think that it's, strangely enough, my eye always lingers to 2 crew portraits, which are also the most unfortunate ones to kind of linger on. But if you look at the crew portraits for Challenger and Columbia, for STS-107 and 51L, their crews are ridiculously diverse and just fascinating individually, like to look at their biographies, their backgrounds. You've got Judy Resnick, who's the first Jewish woman in space. You've got Krista McAuliffe. You've got, and the list goes on through those 2 crews. And those are the kinds of instances that I like to think about the most, that we could key in on to be able to draw somebody in who maybe otherwise isn't interested, or maybe is just kind of aware, but doesn't think it has anything to do with them. And I think that's true, not obviously of just astronauts. And that's my big push in this new exhibit that I'm working on, is that the vast majority of anyone's time involved in the space program is spent on Earth.
Yeah.
So I did an interview with Pam Melroy a few years ago, and one of the things I said was, give me a picture of a day in the life. It's probably not in space. It's basically the very first point, because you spend maybe a total of, 13 days in space, or whatever the average might be for an astronaut. But most of the people are on the ground. And so who from the hundreds of thousands of people on the ground could help me tell a story that would attract a small girl from rural Iowa who has zero connection to any of this stuff. How can I pull on that thread? And so maybe it's Peggy Whitson I talk about, or maybe it's, you can go in a number of different directions. There's lots of great stories of people who are first generation Americans and things like that. So we're always looking for those opportunities. And, you can kind of casually offhanded use the Hidden Figures reference, but it really is that. It's like, who are those people that are making this happen? It's not just about the diversity components, but it's also about professional diversity. That's the thing I like to key in on these days is there are so many different types of jobs. I've often said, it sounds silly, but you could be a security guard and be involved in spaceflight. You could be a librarian. You could be an accountant. There's so many different jobs, and it's how you leverage that. And if you're interested in leveraging your professional knowledge in the service of space exploration, that's the connection that has to get made.
Absolutely. So there are so many other things I want to talk to you about right now. And I think we're going to have that conversation and we'll use your answers in another podcast in a few weeks. So we'll hear more from you in a few weeks. But for now, that has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you very, very much for your time, Dr. Jennifer Levasseur.
Coming at you hotter than a hunk of Skylab over in Australia, you're listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney.
So as I said at the end there's a lot more to come from that interview, but that was the portion of it that was about the space shuttle. And we were very fortunate that Dr. Jennifer also gave us a little tour at Udvar-Hazy and walked us around Discovery and pointed out a few things, which was really, really amazing. It's a wonderful exhibit. So Emily, let's talk Discovery. How impressed were you with that exhibit at Udvar-Hazy?
Oh, wow. I absolutely loved it. I love how Discovery was kind of put in perspective with some other shuttle artifacts, because around it you had the manned maneuvering unit, the one that Bruce McCandless II used on his famous spacewalk 40 years ago this month, which is hard to believe it's been that long. You also had it by TDRS, a tracking and data relay satellite overhead, a pretty high-fidelity mock-up of one, I think one of the first-generation ones. And you also had the shuttle radar topography mission radar boom by it as well, which was also a big shuttle era experiment that they put on, or not an experiment, but a radar, basically big ass radar. I don't know how to put it. There we go. That's my technical way of putting it. Poor Dave here is like, oh God, we have to put this in this. And also there's Canadarm as well. Course, yeah. I almost forgot it. They have Canadarm next to it, which is wonderful because it's not deployed, because the Canadarm was actually fairly heavy. They could only really deploy it in space, but it's parked next to Discovery, and it's really cool because it's cool to see one. I don't think I've seen a real one before. So I love how it's situated against like artifacts from the shuttle program. It's in front of a Space Lab 1 as well. For those of you who may be familiar with it, Space Lab was a European and American laboratory that they put in space, nestled in the shuttle's payload bay for days at a time. It was sort of like a mini space station, if you will. I really like how they have it situated because it really sort of explains the entire shuttle story. Like, this is what it did. This is the capability this thing had. It's obviously situated differently than like Atlantis and obviously Endeavour. Endeavour right now, they're trying to make it look like it's on the pad, which is pretty awesome. But Discovery is basically like in landing position. And I do love that because, number one, it's very simple. There's no bells, whistles, spectaculars, anything like that. So I like that it's kind of simply showing, okay, this is what a workhorse, because Discovery was the fleet workhorse. This is what the workhorse looked like at the end of its career when it came home. And I love that. I think all the different shuttle exhibits in the United States, because there's only 3 orbital shuttles that exist. And I love how they're all situated sort of in different ways that explain the shuttle story. Atlantis is in space, or it's supposed to look like it's in space. Endeavour is supposed to look like it does before ascent when it's on the pad, and Discovery looks like a workhorse at the end of a mission. And I love that. I think it kind of is a nice full circle explanation of the whole program. I really think that's cool. And what I love about Discovery too is, and I think you and I discussed this when we were at Udvar-Hazy, is you can see sort of like the burn pattern on the tiles. You can see the pattern of, how the atmosphere hit it. The tiles look kind of weathered. It's been through a re-entry or several re-entries, and I love that. It looks like a spaceship to me, like because obviously it is a spaceship, but it looks like a spaceship that's done a lot of hard work, and I love it. I think I've said this in previous episodes. Udvar-Hazy just in itself is just freaking incredible. If you haven't been there yet, the visual when you walk into the space portion with the SR-70, I don't want to spoil it if you haven't been there, but when you walk into the space portion of it, you're going to just flip out. I certainly did. It's just amazing. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, so it's worth pointing out as well, is obviously the shuttle is on the ground and you can walk all the way around it. What we discovered talking to Jennifer when we were there is where the shuttle is situated and where two of the other big planes that are in the other hangar, they actually had to reinforce the concrete. So those specific areas have thicker concrete underneath them just to make sure they can take the weight. And the shuttle area is one of those. So it can't be moved. It's there. It's going to stay there. They can't just shift it around a little bit within the museum. So that is a permanent exhibit there, which I think is really wonderful. But there's various gangways and side bits where you can go up some stairs and get different advantages of the space shuttle as well, which I think is also a really cool thing, that you can see it from different perspectives and get a nice well-rounded view of the shuttle. Discovery's got that wonderful teardrop coming out of one of its windows. It's got a little black tile, which distinguishes it from some of the others, and I don't know why that happened. I need to look that up, but I do love that unique part of what makes Discovery. But yeah, the scorch marks are fascinating, and some of them aren't just from re-entry either. Some of them are from the solid rocket motors, which as they drifted away, they just left a little bit of a mark on the back end of the shuttle there. So it's really cool to see that kind of stuff. Obviously, the engines that are there aren't real engines. They had to take those away because part of the maintenance of the shuttle is that there's still liquids and things like that inside. It still leaks. So it still has things in there that as it was when it flew. So all the hydraulic fluids that were within the cabling and all that kind of stuff, all that's still there. So every now and then they have to go and check that nothing else has leaked inside and ruining inside. But obviously within the engines, they had hypergolic fuel, which was bad news. You do not want that to leak.
Yeah, you don't want to get near that. You don't want to get near that. Yeah, nobody wants to get near that.
That's not on display. So, they've taken those out. But the other fascinating thing about what they've done there is obviously we'd all love to go inside, right? We would all love to go inside. But you can't. And it would be too difficult for them to be able to do that. And it would just wreck it. You know that the more footfall you had going in there would not be a good idea. But what they do have is they have a video screen where they have a virtual tour of Jennifer walking you through the space shuttle, both the payload bay and the cockpit. And if you have other questions, they have a whole other thing, which I've never seen before, which is another screen where you've got a docent sitting on a screen waiting for you to go up and ask a question while they're just sitting in their own home. It's amazing. They also still had in-house docents walking around. I saw one with a school field trip, with a laser pointing to the shuttle, explaining where everything was. Cool. So I love how they tell the story of the space shuttle. And I think it's such an important story to tell within our history, within our spaceflight in our lifetime. It's a big deal. And Emily, I thought you asked a really good question asking about the challenges of telling that story when there's negative connotations within it as well. And how do you present the positives of the space shuttle whilst also acknowledging the flaws of the space shuttle at the same time? It's one of those real tough things. You've got to get the balance right, isn't it?
Yeah. If you've listened to the show, you know that Dave and I love the space shuttle, but 14 people died on it. Yeah. It was not a perfect system by any means. It had flaws that unfortunately caused accidents. and loss of life. Do I still love the shuttle? Absolutely. I think it's the space vehicle that defined pretty much my entire life. Not my entire life. I don't want to mention another spacecraft's name, but still, the space shuttle is the one that I grew up with, that I was there start to end. I remember almost everything about it. For us to not acknowledge sort of the other side of the shuttle, that there were major issues with it, I feel like that had to be acknowledged in a way for the interview to be like sort of tasteful. How do you kind of reconcile these two things together? Like, okay, this is an amazing flying machine, really one of the only of its kind in the world, in history, and the fact that it had some real issues that unfortunately caused death. You have to acknowledge these things. You have to acknowledge the real risk it took for people to get on this thing. It wasn't like a capsule. Those are fairly, nice little tiered, nice little kind of jujube design, nice little, it looks like a gumdrop kind of, Shuttle was a lot different. It was enormous, and it had a million complex parts to it, a lot of potential for stuff to go wrong. I thought Jennifer answered it very well too. I think I've said this a million times on this show before, the history of Shuttle is really still being written right now. There's been 1,000,001 books written about Apollo, and there's a lot of good books about Apollo, but, we're seeing like space shuttle stories. Like Tom Jones has a book that's just come out called Space Shuttle Stories. We're still seeing stories come out from the space shuttle that haven't been told before because it was such an enormous program. So really, I feel like it's still being written, and there's still a lot we need to acknowledge about it, I guess.
Absolutely. One of the things we learned while we were there, talking of the dangers of the space shuttle, and neither of us knew this, or it's just something that we've forgotten perhaps. There's so many things to try and retain, and obviously the shuttle had a hell of a lot of missions, so it's hard to retain every single fact you've ever learned about the space shuttle. But one of the things we learned was that on SDS-95, which was the John Glenn flight, the compartment door for the drag chute that is used for landing fell off during launch, and we got told about this, and which is it's just crazy. So they couldn't use a parachute on landing, which isn't the end of the world. But obviously there was concerns of, has anything else been damaged as that door has come off? And I'm sure every spacecraft this launch has had little niggles. Obviously, we know the Apollo program had its niggles. Every spacecraft was slightly different. There would be a few little failures here and there. Some harder to deal with than others. But we have to acknowledge those things more with the shuttle due to the disasters. However, back to the Smithsonian, the way it presents the shuttle at Udvar-Hazy is really special, and they really care. You get the feeling that they really care about telling the story of the program through those artifacts. And from talking to Jennifer, that's even more obvious. They clearly care not just about telling this story now, but for as long as possible, with the incredible conservation and preservation work that they're doing as well, of which we will hear more of later on. Emily mentioned some of the big artifacts that are around Discovery that really helped to tell the story. As she said, the MMU, Man Maneuvering Unit, some of the satellites, Space Lab, things like that. Really cool artifacts. But there are also lots of cabinets filled with items which were used by astronauts on board. Pens, cameras, computers, the food they ate. What was it like to be on a shuttle? How do we learn that story? They tell that too. They even helped tell the story of what it's like getting into the shuttle. There was some outfits worn by the closeout crews on display. The diversity of the artifacts, in my opinion, really creates a well-rounded view of the space shuttle. Emily, I think you are right. I know we talk about this a lot. The shuttle story is just beginning to get told. And we now look at how we started this podcast talking about Endeavour in California, where we're going to be able to see it in launch configuration. And that just enhances the telling of that story and shows that we're still preparing to tell the story. Anyway, there is a lot more of that interview, which is about being a curator, which we're piecing together with the other interviews that we did with at the Smithsonian. So you'll hear more from Dr. Levasseur in a few weeks. Or if you're one of our Patreon subscribers, you can watch that interview in full now. Head over to patreon.com/Space and Things for more. Plus, make sure you check out the episodes of the Apollo 13 Minute podcast, which she features on. They're really great. And of course, I'll put links to that in the show notes, along with other links about Dr. Levasseur and the Smithsonian. You can find the show notes by clicking on the link in the description of this episode in your podcast provider, or by heading to spaceandthingspodcast.com.
Houston, we've got a reading here that says you're listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney. Over.
Okay, Emily, what has caught your eye in spaceflight this last week?
Okay, well, what has caught my eye this week is not really the happiest story, but this is from the Space Review. This article just came out last night, and of course, we'll have the link in our show notes. The Mars Sample Return Program is according to this article by Jeff Faust, is at serious risk. We have discussed this issue on our show several times, most recently with our interview with Casey Dreyer from the Planetary Society, where we talked about space policy and budgets. But last Tuesday, it was announced that JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, would lay off 530 employees, or about 8% of its total workforce, along with 40 contractors. According to this article, and I'm reading this directly from the article, not my words, the layoffs were the culmination of two intertwined threads. One is the lack of a fiscal year 2024 appropriations bill for NASA, and the rest of the federal government more than 4 months into the fiscal year. The other is the uncertainty about the futures of Mars sample returns, one of the biggest programs there right now. JPL Director Lori Leshin, I hope I'm saying her name right, wrote in a memo to lab employees, and this was published online. While we still do not have an FY24 appropriation or the final word from Congress on our Mars sample return budget allocation, we are now in a position where we must take further significant action to reduce our spending. Unfortunately, that resulted in layoffs. So there are some kind of serious issues related to Mars sample returns. According to this article, NASA has established what is called the MIRT, or the MSR IRB response team, because JPL and NASA, as we know, love acronyms. This response team is going to examine alternative options for retrieving the samples, which are currently being collected by the Perseverance rover on Mars that's been there for, I think, almost 3 years. So yeah, that's what's going on right now. NASA, according to the article, again, these aren't my words, NASA said it expected MIRT, to come up with a recommendation for a new approach for MSR, Mars sample return, by March. Yeah, so I'm going to keep my eye on that. I'm sure Dave will as well, but kind of an unfortunate turn of events in this whole Mars sample return saga, and it also kind of drives home how expensive this will be. I mean, if they're laying off a lot of people.
Yeah, it's amazing how Casey kind of laid out exactly that this would happen, that there would be layoffs, whilst the budget hasn't been approved, and then it makes everything a lot more expensive because you've then had to pay layoff fees, and then you have to rehire everyone again if it then gets approved, and that's how budgets end up going up. Anyway, listen to that interview with Casey if you haven't already. Sad times over at JPL, that's for sure.
Yeah, unfortunate. And if you're one of the people who unfortunately was laid off, and if you're listening, our thoughts are with you. I've been in that spot in my life before, and I know how not fun that is. So, hopefully on a better note, has anything caught your eye over the last couple of weeks, Dave?
I have been so busy with decorating, I haven't really kept my eye on the news, I'll be brutally honest. It's one of those things where you sometimes end up just not paying any attention. But I did have a quick browse today, and it looks like we might have a Starship launch coming up soon, which is fun. And briefly, we had 20 people in space, apparently, for a little bit last week, which is a record, which is pretty cool.
A lot, yeah.
I mean, it's pretty crazy, isn't it? There's been a new record for the total time in space for a single person. Oleg Kononenko. We haven't done a cosmonaut name in ages.
I think it's Oleg Kononenko. I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm getting it as close as I can without a Russian accent.
Yeah, Oleg Kononenko. Oh my God, he has done 80. He's broken a record of 879 days in space, which is pretty cool. On this flight, he will end up going past 1,000 days, which is
wow.
Yeah, he'll be the first person to do that. So that's pretty cool and pretty crazy. The Virgin Galactic mothership lost an alignment pin during the last space launch. That's obviously not the spacecraft itself, but part of the plane that the spacecraft is launched upon. So I don't know much about it, but I will put a link to that article for other people to read in the show notes, as well as the other thing I will put in is a little bit about the Axiom 3 mission, which came to an end this week as well. Anyway, so I haven't looked at anything in detail, but they're the headlines that jumped out at me, and I will put those articles in the show notes for people to read if they wish to.
And remember, when you're sleeping in space, no one can hear you dream.
Okay, that's it for this week. This, of course, may end up being the start of the final 20 episodes of the podcast.
No!
We still need 19 people to sign up to our Patreon page to hit our target by show 200. So if you're willing and able to support us in that way, we'd really appreciate it. Please head over to patreon.com/Space and Things to do that.
We will definitely be back next week, though, so we look forward to spending some time with you then. Thank you for listening, and thanks to all who do support this podcast financially. It really does mean a lot. But don't forget, in space, no one can hear you mean.